Hey everybody, so today we are continuing our reading of October Sky, and we are going to be reading chapter 20, and it begins on page 302. So as always, have your book with you, have a pen with you, and get ready to take notes as I stop and point out key points. All right, so again, we are on page 302. My dad's eye had not healed properly. He had kept it, but it was unfocused and watery. The doctor in Welsh said it would likely remain that way for the rest of his life. Dad held one hand over his bad eye to read his newspapers and magazines and to watch television. He and Mom had made a kind of peace as far as I could tell. They acted as if nothing had happened, although they rarely spoke. Dad and I had little to say to one another. Mom spoke to me kindly, asking how schoolwork was going, but nothing of consequence. Jim might as well have been a ghost in the house as far as I was concerned. It was rare when the family had supper together, and when we did, there was only the lonely clinking of our forks and knives on our plates. There was at least Daisy May, ever my gentle confidant. So you do want to make note that the father, Homer, did not lose his eye. Okay. Mom stayed in her room in the morning and let me get up on my own. Without her prodding, Jim had no trouble waking up in time to spend his hour in the bathroom, but I missed the bus a couple of times, had to hitch a ride over, was late, and got called into Mr. Turner's office. If it happened one more time, he promised, I was in more trouble than I could possibly imagine. It happened again in mid-May, despite the alarm clock I borrowed from Odell. I found myself standing across the filling station with my thumb out toward war. Jake pulled up in his Corvette. "Where to?" he asked, swinging open the door. It was good to see him. He'd been in Ohio since the accident. I didn't know why. "Big Creek, I'm late," I clambered inside. A gleam came to Jake's eye. "Well, all right," he cried, and slammed his foot down on the accelerator. We shot past the mine and up Coalwood Mountain. He was drinking and handed over the bottle. "You drink, don't you?" "Not before school," I replied. A true statement as far as it went. He put the bottle to his lips and made 3 successive curves at once without looking. I saw Geneva Eggers in front of her house wearing canvas trousers and a plaid shirt and sitting on a fence post. I slid down in my seat when Jake slowed the Corvette to a crawl and rolled down his window. "Howdy, Miss Eggers," he said, tipping an imaginary hat and sliding into the southern West Virginia vernacular. "How you feeling this fine morning?" You'll remember Geneva Eggers was the one that Homer saved as a baby from her house fire that killed her family, and she is the one that kind of rescued Homer when he was stranded on that winter night when they had sledded. Anyway, and she's the one that kind of dried his clothes out and fed him and everything, and his dad said that he should stay away from her because she had been doing prostitution and different things to make the money that she needed, and everybody kind of turned her head because they kind of knew that she had to have ways of making money, and they'd given her he'd let her stay in a little shack out in the woods. So anyway, I just wanted to remind you who she was. "Why, I'm feeling just fine, Jake," she said. She peered inside the car. "Who you got there?" "Oh," she smiled prettily when she recognized me. "How you feeling, Sonny? Did you miss the bus again?" I slid ever deeper in the seat. "Yes'm," I mumbled. "Well, y'all take it easy," she said as we idled on by. "Oh, that's a fine woman," he said over the shriek of tires. "She sure seems to like you, old son. How do you know her?" I shrugged. Once when it was snowing, she let me warm up by her stove. Jake laughed a great open-mouthed laugh as only he could, and we know why he's laughing because he knows about Geneva Eggers himself. When we got to Big Creek, I thanked Jake and made a run for chemistry class. When I got there, I realized I'd left my books in his car. Miss Riley was sitting at her desk placidly noting our arrivals when Jake strolled in with them. She glanced at him a second or two, longer than I thought was necessary, and then went back to her attendance roster. I waved, and he brought me my books over. "Who's your teacher?" was all he wanted to know. I introduced them, and they shook hands. "So I believe you are an engineer, Mr. Mosby?" Miss Riley asked in a dulcet voice I had never heard her use before. "I have a degree, Frida. but some would question if I am an engineer," he replied oh so smoothly. "The Rocket Boys tell me you're their favorite teacher, and I must say I'm impressed by their taste." She blushed and looked down at her papers. "Well, do call again, Mr. Mosby." Now, don't you think that's funny that he didn't call her Miss Riley? What did he call her? He called her Frida. And notice how she's kind of talking to him a little bit differently than Sonny's ever seen her talk. So that's kind of a little hint that something might develop here. "Jake," he answered, all but flipping his eyebrows up and down in anticipation. "You can count on that, Frida." He bent over me on the way out. "Forget the school bus, kid. You've got a chauffeur anytime you want it." I'm not certain when it dawned on me that Jake and Miss Riley were going out, but one day she called me to her desk after class and wanted to know more information about Mr. Mosby, who his friends were, what people thought of him, and so forth. I lied, of course, and told her how respected and beloved he was in Coalwood. I figured I owed Jake at least a good recommendation. It was a character-building exercise, since to my surprise, I was jealous. Yeah, why was he jealous, huh? As the school year wound down, the junior class and I walked the halls with a sense of impending ownership. We suspected that the good times were finally about to roll. The BCMA met in my room just before school let out. We had several issues to discuss. We needed money, I said, to buy zinc dust. We also still had a debt to Mr. Van Dyke for the telephone equipment. You'll remember how they'd gotten the telephone equipment from the shed? It was telephone equipment that the mines were not using anymore, but still they didn't have the right to just get it. They said they were borrowing it. So, Odell looked around to make certain no one was listening other than us boys. Only Chipper and Daisy May were in the room, and both of them were asleep. Satisfied, he bade us to lean in closer. "There's scrap iron out there, boys," he whispered. "It's like gold. All we have to do is dig it up." He explained, with the track pulled out of Coalwood, the N&W Railroad Company had abandoned their spur line in the wilderness of Big Branch about 5 miles west of Cape Coalwood. Underneath the track were cast iron drainage pipes. "Here's what we do," Odell said. "We dig up those pipes, bust them into pieces, and sell the lot to a scrapyard. We'll make a ton of money, and it's all legal." "Why don't we just take the rails?" Roy Lee wanted to know in a burst of logic and suspicion. "They're easier to get at. If we took the rails, the scrapyard might be suspicious and tell the railroad company," Odell answered. "What difference would that make?" Sherman wanted to know. "If it's legal to get the pipes, isn't it legal to get the rails?" Sherman and Roy Lee's doubts did not fit Odell's universe. "No," he said, as if that was explaining everything. "It took a month to get our expedition prepared, so we were approaching the end of June by the time Red drove me, Sherman, Odell, and Roy Lee in the back of the garbage truck to the abandoned track. Quentin and Billy were visiting out-of-state relatives for the summer. Odell's father led us with a pile of assorted supplies, including a canvas tent, sleeping bags, a camp stove, 4 grocery bags filled with canned food, mostly beef stew, a few crates of bottled sodas, some loaves of white bread, a couple of big cartons of moon pies, several boxes of matches, a wheelbarrow, 2 shovels, 2 sledgehammers, and a pick. The tools in the wheelbarrow were borrowed from several different families. We'd pulled our meager resources to buy the food. We set up camp in a small clearing and then went looking for our first pipe. We found it 100 yards past a timber trestle bridge. We looked over the bank to where the pipe protruded. "Good God," Roy Lee moaned. "It's under 10 feet of dirt." Now, I should have pointed this out earlier, so make sure you noted on page 305 that at the abandoned line where they had pulled up tracks in Coalwood, okay, in the wilderness of Big Branch, they are going to be getting cast iron drainage pipes so that they can sell them to scrap yards. And you know, people do stuff like that now as far as different types of metals when they're valuable. Sometimes copper, different aluminum. It just depends on what kind of scrap metal is popular at the time. I know that we have scrap metal many times that we'll call certain people who want it, and they come and get it to take to scrap metal yards for money. So people still do that. So anyway, you'd want to make a note of what they're going to do. So They notice on page 306, like he said, Roy Lee mentions that that pipe that they won is under 10 feet of dirt. So Odell says, "What did you expect?" Odell demanded. "You think the railroad company was going to lay drainage pipes on top of the ground?" He took a shovel and pushed it into the track bed. It penetrated barely a half inch. "It is kind of hard," he admitted. I picked up the other shovel and a copperhead snake crawled out from underneath it. I jumped about 10 foot straight up in the air and came down running. "Stand back," Odell said. "I'll take care of this." He took a big swing at the snake with his shovel, missed the terrified reptile by at least 6 inches, lost his footing, and fell over the embankment. I ran to the edge and looked for him, but all I saw was a muddy stain in the river far below. I called out to him, but there was no response. Both Roy Lee and Sherman sat down on the track, holding their stomachs from laughing. What if he broke his neck, I worried. "Take more than 100-foot fall to hurt that boy," Roy Lee said, in all seriousness. When Odell finally climbed back up the track bed, wet but unhurt, to dig, we dug all that day and the next and the next. It rained every day, and we found ourselves working up to our necks in sticky brown mud. At camp, everything became covered with mold. Our food started to rot. I didn't care. After each day's labor, we'd wash in the river and sit around our campfire and listen to the sounds of the dense forest. The wind rustling through the trees, the munching of deer feeding on crab apples, the crackle of raccoons in the underbrush, the owls hooting their mournful cry. After months of tension and worry, I felt grateful to be detached from Coalwood and all its problems. I hadn't realized how lonely and miserable I'd become until I went down into the wilds of Big Branch. There, with nobody around but Roy Lee, Sherman, and Odell, I could be just another boy again. I put Coalwood and even my parents out of my mind and took in all the sounds and sights and smells of God's nature everywhere about me. For the first time in months, I was genuinely happy. And I would make a note of that, because just remember the stress that he had on him. He has the stress of them being in the science fair, having to win. Why was he stressed out about that? Because now the boys have said, we depend on that for scholarship. We depend on that recognition. And he was stressed after the death of Ike and feeling guilty for that. Remember, he almost gave up until Miss Riley and Miss Bykowski both talked to him and encouraged him and got him kind of motivated again. His dad's been injured. His dad still wants him to be an engineer in the mine. So there's just a lot of different things coming at Sonny from many different directions. So I'm sure it is nice to be secluded with just his friends, kind of away from the stress of building rockets and everything right now. Okay? So when it got dark and a river of stars flowed overhead, we spread out at our sleeping bags and laid down on them and talked. After we exhausted the topic of females, we considered the future. We agreed we were all going to make it into space. The United States would need men like us to be explorers and adventurers. It would be an adventure like the one we were having at Big Branch. If we lay there long enough, we were blessed with a satellite, American or Russian. We were never sure, streaking across the sky. It still made my heart beat a little faster to see one. So just imagine these boys just at night kind of laying out on their sleeping bags, staring up at the dark sky, watching these satellites go across. How exciting, because they know that one day they too hope to be a part of the space adventure. Okay, so after 5 days of digging, guys, 5 days, we were finally rewarded with the sound of a pick hitting cast iron. When we finished uncovering the pipe, we looked like the mudmen of Borneo worshiping a fallen idol. Sherman picked up a sledgehammer and fell to smacking the dang thing. I took the next turn at the hammer, smacking the pipe over and over until a crack appeared. Odell finally succeeded in knocking a chunk loose. We all jumped into the hole and admired the triangular iron fragment. It had taken nearly a week of hard labor to extract that tiny little piece. Undaunted, we got stronger every day and refined our technique. Red ferried in more food, and 2 weeks later we had piled up a treasure trove of cast iron almost as high as our tent. We were on our 10th pipe when I clambered into its deep hole to take my turn at breaking it up. After hammering out a pile of jagged iron fragments, I slipped while crawling out and threw back my left hand to catch myself. My hand plunged into the pile of iron, and I could feel a sharp edge slice into my wrist. It didn't hurt that bad. Roy Lee started laughing, not because my fall was particularly funny, but because he was so exhausted he had turned giddy. I pulled my hand out of the cast iron fragments and looked with wonder at my wrist, painted a bright red, and then I saw a spurt of blood. I laughed as another geyser of blood went flying. Odell saw it and laughed too, and so did Sherman. Look, I giggled, crawling out of the hole. I'm bleeding to death. Now, guys, most of us wouldn't laugh at that, but again, have you ever kind of been at a sleepover with some friends and you get grouchy one moment and then you get like really tired to where you're kind of laughing about everything? It's like you're almost drunk from being exhausted. Let me see that, Odell said, sobering up. He held up my wrist. There was an inch-wide slit across it. I could see the O of the severed artery. Oh, no. Suddenly, I felt dizzy and sat down and stared dumbly at the scarlet geyser until I started to giggle again, and then we all giggled inanely at each other. We got to stop the bleeding, Odell finally managed. He took off his T-shirt and pressed it against the cut, then tore a strip from it and made a tourniquet. He wrapped it 6 inches above the cut, using a stick to wrench it tight. We got to get Doc, he said. So make a note that when Roy was down in the ditch getting some of the pipe, that he has slit his wrist. I was no longer laughing. As hot as that summer day was, I felt cold because he had been losing blood. I sank down on a rail and hung my head, my brain spinning. I'll wait here while you get him, I said, my eyes suddenly heavy. Maybe I'll just take a little nap. If we walk out, it'll take us most of the day, Odell said, checking the height of the sun, and it'll be dark. By the time we make it back, he looked at me. Sonny, wake up. You've got to walk with us. I slid off the track and wallowed in the dirt, feeling the sun on my face. Oh, I don't think so. Sherman and Roy Lee started to laugh again, but Odell stopped them. We got to get him to Doc, you guys. This is serious. He cranked the tourniquet tighter. We got to, or he's going to die. Die? I perked up. Who's going to die? You are, you moron, Odell said, and grabbed me under my armpits and tried to pull me to my feet. The other boys, sobered now, helped me up. I leaned on Sherman and we started to walk up the track. It took us 6 hours to walk out. When we got to Frog Level, it was nearly dark. I lay down in the middle of the road while Odell went after his father. I saw a satellite and then another, streams of them dashing across the heavens, red and pink and white and blue and green. And then the bowl of sky began to turn, slowly at first and then faster and faster. Sherman and Roy Lee took turns waking me up, but by the time Odell came back, I had passed out. Reds picked me up and loaded me into the back of the garbage truck. At Doc's house, his wife appraised me at the front door, holding her nose at the smell, and announced that Doc wasn't there but was probably at his office. That's where we found him. He also held his nose. The back of the garbage truck had added a final ode to pig slop to the mildew and slime from our camp, and led me back to his examining room. He sat me on the table, unwrapped the tourniquet and the soggy dressing, observed with interest the waning spurt of the little blood left inside me, and hauled out his suture kit. You want me to deaden your wrists, he asked. Oh, yes, sir, I said groggily. He shrugged. Your dad got all his stitches in his forehead without any painkiller whatsoever. I rose to his challenge. Then I don't need it either. Doc plunged the needle in it. It hurt, and I howled. Deaden it, he said. Nah, too late now, Doc said. He happily sewed while sweat popped out in huge drops on my forehead. I swayed, nearly passing out every time he plunged the needle in. Very good, Sonny, he said after a lifetime. All finished. Hop up. I hopped up and fainted. I woke on the cot with Mom looking down at me. She had her nose covered with a handkerchief. Sonny, dear God, but you had me worried. Hi, Mom, I smiled weakly. Doc's face appeared. The other boys walked him out. Their tourniquet pretty well saved him. He lifted my arm, checked the bandage around my wrist. You're going to have a nice scar, young man, to remind you of this particular adventure. Can we go home, Doc? Mom asked. I hope so, he said. The fumigators are due any minute. Mom walked me out, the other boys jumping to their feet in the waiting room. They clustered around the car as I sagged onto the bench seat. Go get the scrap iron, I gasped at them. Mom made me take a shower in the basement before letting me upstairs. I lay down on my bed and heard Dad come in from the mine. Then my door swung open. He and Mom entered. You okay, little man? It was wonderful to hear Dad's voice. "I'm fine," I said. I looked up at my parents. It made me so happy to see them together. It took everything I could muster not to cry. "I'm sorry, like always." Dad said, "You have nothing to be," but I fell into a deep sleep before he finished. It was a sleep packed with dreams of swirling colors, as if I were in the midst of a gigantic kaleidoscope whirlpool. Once I came to and was surprised to see Jim in the bedroom with me, sitting at my desk watching me with something like concern on his face. Was I dreaming? He's in shock that Jim would be concerned about him. And I don't know, I like to take note of the fact that Sonny also appreciated the fact that his mom and dad were together checking on him. Remember, he always, I imagine it seems like he's kind of concerned always about his mom and dad's relationship, because it sometimes seems like a love-hate relationship between the mom and Homer. The next day, while I still slept, the other boys went back to Big Branch and loaded the pile of scrap iron onto the garbage truck, forgetting the tools and the wheelbarrow, and carried it to Welch and the Chester Matney scrapyard. Mr. Matney weighed it carefully, more than 400 pounds, make note of that, and then counted out the $22.50 he figured he owed us. Now, guys, I'm sure at that time that was a lot of money to them, but think about that now. How many days were they there? About a week of digging, 10 feet under the ground. They dug up 400 pounds of metal for $22. That doesn't sound like a lot for a whole week's work, does it? We had expected at least $1 a pound. "No," Mr. Matney said, "prices were down. After subtracting out the cost of the food and ignoring the cost of the ruined sleeping bags and the lost tools, we made a grand total of $4. So I would mark that. Did you notice that he said that it's usually $1 a pound? So guys, what they thought would be, what, about $400 they'd make? They made 22, but then they did have to subtract the cost of all the expenses. So a whole week's worth of work, digging 10 feet under the ground for 400 pounds of metal. They end up their profit being $4. Wow. I'm sorry, 5. Oh yeah, notice that it said, that was before Doc sent me a personal bill for $5 for sutures and labor. So guys, did they make money? It looks like they're $1 in debt, basically, when it comes to profit. Jake came to our rescue. If we promised to wash and wax his Corvette for approximately the rest of time, he'd cover our debts. We took him up on it, paid off Mr. Van Dyke and Doc, for the phones and for the bill for sutures, plus the people whose tools we had lost. We also bought 10 pounds of zinc dust. So make a note of that, guys, that Jake paid off their debts if they would wax his Corvette, okay? So that's cool. So they ended up getting the money for their zinc dust, 10 pounds. Make notes of that. So that is the end of chapter 20 on their little adventure digging up pipe. So anyway, we will end there and we will begin with chapter 21 next time, called Zinco Shine. Have a good day. It's beautiful out here.